Today we're going to be working with oil pastel, and we're going to be doing something from a still life. So today we're going to be drawing a pepper in oil pastel. So I have here cartridge paper. This is just A4 smooth cartridge paper, and on it I've actually done an HB drawing with pencil of a pepper. I don't know if you can see that close up. Now, if you don't feel confident to make a freehand based upon my reference picture, which will be in the comments, then what you can do is you can always just print that out and trace around the outline and then just fill in the middle pieces for yourself. Or you could observe from still life and use a pepper of your own and make your own drawing and then just follow the way that we actually colour that. The choice is yours, so you've got kind of several options really. So the colours we're going to be using, we need like a rubyish red colour, and I've actually got two here. One's kind of more ruby, the other one is more red. And then we need some sort of orangey shade, so I've got a kind of light orange and a medium orange. We'll need a yellow ochre, and then a royal blue, and then a grey. So you can either use a Payne's grey or a dark grey, but we don't use black. The other thing I've got here is what we call a colour shaper, which we can use to blend. Now don't worry if you don't have one of these. It's literally just like a paintbrush handle, and then it just has like a rubberized end where you can just use it as a tool to blend. If you don't have one of these, then just use your finger. We'll also be doing finger blending too. The other thing to have handy is the trusty baby wipes, because you probably will end up getting some oil pastel on your fingers, and you want to just make sure that you're not transferring colours that you don't want onto your page. So we'll start with just going over our outlines. So I'm going to start over on this side. Now the first thing you'll notice is you don't get a very pointed tip on these, especially if you've got ones which are fresh out the box. They're very blunted, so your sort of end that has more definition, you might want to kind of go along that edge. So if you're thinking like here, for example, if this is your sharpest edge, you could just use that edge there. You can even just peel this to reveal a little bit more if you wish, or you could always use a craft knife very carefully and just take a section off to give you an area which is more defined. I'm going to actually try this end here. That actually feels more like I'm using something that's a drawing implement and less like a crayon. So if you struggle with how it feels and it feels very clumsy and you feel like that's going to affect the drawing that you're going to make, then find ways to use an edge. So what I might do here is to just take off some of this wrapping here, just remove that bottom edge like so, and then I can just use that. This is, for me, this is preferable to this, if you see what I mean. So I'm just going to go around that outer edge that I've put in with the pencil, which is my underdrawing. And the oil pastel will cover your pencil, but what I would say is you want to make your pencil lines quite faint. And I would always recommend, whenever you make an underdrawing, don't go in too hard, because when you try and cover something which is a very hard pencil line, it can often show through and it can cause you a few issues. So just a little tip if you are making an underdrawing, to just kind of keep it subtle. So I'm just going over those lines, and then over here too, just add some of that in, and perhaps here. One thing I have done in my drawing, and what you'll see is in my finished piece, there will be areas where the light is shining on the subject, and those areas will be light. So what you might want to do is just very gently with your pencil is to just kind of preserve those areas. So I've just sort of marked them out as shapes. So if you think back to what we did in the charcoal exercise when we were looking at shapes of tone, so we were looking at the dark areas and the light areas, this is the same principle. We're kind of almost blocking off where those areas may be. I'm going to go up here. I'm going to want the subject to be slightly darker towards the bottom as well, so I'll start to lay some of that colour in. And again, you can still be quite sort of sketchy when you're working with your pastels, because what we do is we tend to, as always, it's a layered medium, so we tend to build our layers as we go. So I'm kind of looking for my darker areas of red where I want to put those. And then what I'm going to want to do is perhaps take my slightly lighter shade. So you can see there's not much in it with these two. This one is more of a vibrant red than that ruby colour. So I might want to just work up from the bottom and see whether there really is much of a difference. And in fact, when you lay it down on the page, it's very hard to discern any kind of a difference there. So what I might want to do is to start using my darker orange and start to almost build up some tonally different areas. Now this looks sort of far too orange really, so if I lay my orange down and we think about those blending techniques, we might want to do is to just start to build those in. Don't forget to preserve any areas where we're going to have light play on the subject later. So I'm using a fairly heavy pressure here. Remember not to go outside of your line. So if you're using a very blunt end and you've kind of drawn in very narrowly your outline, just be careful that you're not sort of breaching that boundary. Now what I will start to do here is with this, I'm just going to see how these blend together. And this actually allows for quite sort of refined blending. As I say, don't worry if you don't have one of these, you can just use your finger. The disadvantage to this is it sort of almost pulls off some of the pastel's property, so you start to see kind of almost pinkish areas. So what I might want to do is to just build those up again, because one of the nice things when you work with oil pastel is that you get that lovely kind of waxiness to your work, and that's actually quite nice. It's quite a nice quality to have. So as much as you can have broken areas if you wish, you can also get those really nice kind of heavy pressured areas, and it almost looks like the surface of a very highly polished pepper. So it starts to emulate that surface texture, which is quite nice. Now if you don't have this, just make sure your fingers are clean and make sure they're not really greasy with anything on them. So do sort of wash your hands first and dry them. This is where we start to get annoying little pieces over our work. Don't worry about those too much. If you have something like my trusty eraser brush, then you can just do that, or you can just very gently wipe them with your finger. And the problem is once your paper starts to become marked, because it's oily, there's not a lot that will get it off. I can try a plastic eraser, because some of it might just be kind of dirt from the surface and it might take some of it off. So just be a little bit careful. If your fingers are dirty here, just give them a wipe. So as I said earlier, you need to be a little bit careful when you're layering with these, especially if you're using different brands like I am, because that surface texture can start to become a bit, I was going to say unpleasant. It's not unpleasant, it just kind of looks broken, or almost like a sort of peeling effect that you can get occasionally when you have two oil pastels that don't blend very well together. It almost looks as though something's gone wrong and you've kind of ended up with, how can I describe it? Well, it's a difficult one to explain, which is why I'm struggling. You kind of have to sort of see it in action, really. At the moment, this is a really nice surface texture, but if I come across an area where this starts to happen, I will try and show you. But you'll know it when you see it. The other thing you'll start to get is these bits on top. So just gently brush them with a stiff brush that you don't use for painting. Sometimes if you get paint sets from very cheap shops and they have brushes, you'll get one which is kind of like, I've got one here somewhere. If I can see it. I can't see the wood for the trees at the moment with all the things on my studio desk. No, it's not there. But you often get brushes which almost look like this. They're very sort of cheap and nasty and kind of very, what's the word? Well, you wouldn't use them for painting. Like this. Here's one. These are really good for dry brushing, but if you don't use it for art, then just keep it on your desk and just use it as something which you can clean your paper up with. So, I digress. So we'll come back in and we'll just start to block in those darker reds. And as I say, don't forget to kind of preserve the areas where the light play appears on the subject. So I might want to just vary that by putting a little bit of orange in there. Otherwise it's just going to look very sort of one-dimensional. If you only use one colour with one tone, you're going to get something which just doesn't really have a lot of variety. So you might want to just put some subtle hints of something else in there. So here this is kind of quite similar in tone, I would say. So I'll carry on with that red and really block that in. And again, just preserving those areas where the light is going to fall on that subject. You can actually cover quite a lot of ground here. The other thing you might find useful when you use oil pastels is as you use them and you're laying down the pressure, gently sort of roll them, because that way it sort of, A, it wears it quite evenly, and B, it just sort of gives you a fresh bit of pastel when you're using it. It just helps to kind of create a smooth effect when you do very heavy pressure, so you might find that useful. So I'm just preserving an area here where we're going to want some light play. I'm going to do all of this with this very smooth ruby red. So don't forget to roll that pastel in your fingers. You should get less of those kind of annoying waxy flecks coming off if you do this too, which is helpful. And what you might want to do, another way of indicating the kind of light play, is to use less pressure. So if you have some subtle light play on a particular area, we can create that broken sort of texture here just with lighter strokes. So we'll use a bit of pressure variance. So when you come from very heavy strokes to very light strokes, lay your light strokes down next to your heavier strokes, and then you can almost flick up from the bottom with the heavy pressure into the light pressure, just with short strokes, and then that will allow those two areas to just sort of converge and mix nicely together. So what we want to do is we want to start kind of almost showing the shape of the pepper, just by using kind of careful blending and careful colour selection. Hopefully that will start to pay dividends and show us that we've got different areas. You might want to again use just some very light pressure here, and then what we can do is we can always blend that. So we've just got some different techniques to just indicate that there is light on the subject and that the light doesn't fall kind of evenly in different places. And that should start to make the object look slightly more three-dimensional. Just going to go around this top part here. So you can see that kind of main front panel of the pepper is starting to come together. The problem that you can often have with oil pastel is if you don't preserve enough of those white areas, then what tends to happen is you then end up having to try and add them afterwards, and it never really works, because if you lay down white pastel on top, you have to be really careful how you do it because it's very hit and miss. So we will probably be putting some of those white highlights in towards the end, and we might use some white pastel for that, or we might use blending. I haven't decided yet. But we just need to make sure that we don't sort of go crazy with that heavy pressure, because apart from scratching out and actually taking some of that pastel off, it's quite tricky to then get those lights in. So if you are going to work in sort of darker or very bold areas, you need to think about where your light areas are. So you need to plan them really. It's a bit like when you work in watercolour. You need to understand where you're preserving the paper or where the light areas might be. You can't just kind of go in gung-ho and expect it to work, because you will come unstuck. As I say, you can scratch back areas, but how successful that might be, it kind of depends. Depends on lots of things, how dark a colour you're using, for example. So what we'll do is we'll kind of plan our composition and make sure that we preserve the areas that we want. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to use a little bit of lighter pressure here, and then I'm going to just give my finger a wipe with one of these baby wipes, because you can see you start to get quite dirty when you're working. The colour does transfer to your fingers. So give those a wipe. Don't forget about that edge there, because that's where you pick up colour when you draw with things that transfer, and that's where you start to transfer it back to your paper as well. So just give your fingers a wipe and then have a go at just blending with your finger along this part here where we've got a lighter area. Now what you might find, like I just have, is if your nails are slightly long, you might sgraffito accidentally along an area that you're trying to blend. So either use a finger that's got a shorter nail, or just be very careful as you work. Now I'm getting these annoying pieces which transfer to the heavy areas, so I'm just going to knock those off of my paper. So it almost causes a bit of surface interference. Just use a bit of a gentle circular motion. I'm starting to get quite a mess on my background where I'm picking up lots of different things. So again, if you want to have a white background, just try again with an eraser. As I said, this is an irregular eraser, it's not a putty eraser, or there's no special eraser that I know of for oil pastel. But if you're not worried about your background, then don't worry about it too much. Sometimes people will advocate blending with a baby wipe. Now I've got an area here on the baby wipe which is not really very wet because it's been kind of like left open, and that's another alternative. Use very light pressure because you can drag the pigment of the pastel off the paper. But you can experiment as well perhaps with tissue paper, which is another very useful thing for blending. So always keep your tissue paper when your packages turn up. And if you have this accidental sgraffito problem that I just had with a nail, again this works quite well. So because we're not using wet blending, which I have done in previous classes and previous exercises, we're just going to use these pastels dry. So we want to play with the blending techniques. Now this works quite nicely where we've got these areas here where we've used the very light pressure. It's quite nice to just kind of blend that and also drag some of the surrounding colour across those areas. So I might want to just blend that heavy pressure area here to almost smooth it, and then sort of drag some of that colour across. Sometimes people don't like the feel of oil pastel on the surface when they're blending, so again this is quite a nice thing to do. As I say, make sure your baby wipe is not too moist with the chemicals that they put on it, because otherwise you'll just create big holes in your work. So there we go, we can start to see some of that there. And I might also want to put a little bit of orange around there too, just to kind of indicate a little bit of variety. And I might want to use a clean finger to just encourage that into the surface of the paper. So I'm going to move across over to this side, and this is very similar. So we're just going to use that heavy pressure again. And don't forget, if you're going around those edges and you want it to be neat, just use that other end of your pastel, because that way you've got a little bit more control over where you're laying that pastel down. But when you're doing those great big areas, transfer back to this, otherwise you're going to wear this end down and you won't have any more delicate end to work with. So again, go for that quite heavy pressure, and make sure you're working on a smooth surface as well, because otherwise it's like when you work with a pencil, if you've got something underneath the paper, then it will start to pick up the texture of it, and it can sort of interfere with your work. So again, I'm just going to use very light pressure over that preserved area that I penciled in earlier. Seems to be quite a nice way of just creating areas where the light's shining. And you can start to see your picture coming together now. It's starting to look like an object. There's no reason why you have to use red. I mean, you can always, if you had more greens in your set, for example, though I would always say be wary of greens because they can be a bit tricky. But, you know, they come in lots of different colours. Red is a good one if you've got lots of shades of red in your set. It's also quite nice and vibrant. But if you wanted to experiment and you have your own peppers at home, then you can always try it in different colours, or maybe you want to set up a little still life of your own so that you can show the different colours that you have in your set and start to look at the way that natural objects behave. But don't forget, if you are going to set up a still life, then try and set one up where you've got a defined light source, and then that way you can kind of add your shadow areas in and start to play with the shadow areas too. It's not a total sort of game over if you don't have a defined light source, because in my studio, as I've explained before, I have a very diffuse light, so we don't really get cast shadow unless I set up a light box. But it's fine. You can work whichever way you choose. And this is quite a nice exercise as well, just to get to know your pastels. I'm going to try a bit of a lighter orange up here too, just to have a play, see what happens, because we don't know until we try. And peppers aren't all one colour. I mean, even when they're very ripe and very red, you'll still see sometimes little areas of green or orange or yellow. They really vary. Don't forget, don't go gung-ho. Make sure that you work in a considered way and you don't cover all of that white. If you did cover all of the white, just to kind of demonstrate to you, if you wanted to uncover some of it, you can just use Sgraffito just to reveal some of those highlights. And if you don't have the blender, you could always use something like the blunt end of the bamboo skewer just to kind of define your edges, so you could go over your edges. It will Sgraffito them out slightly, but you can always come back in and blend with your finger. So try combining techniques and just sort of playing with things. Try a bit of finger blending, try a bit of a dry-ish wipe, baby wipe, and see what works for you. See what you can learn just from this exercise and get to know your materials as well. It's me getting stuck to my masking tape. I always have spare bits of masking tape I can reuse, which are on my edges of my desk, and sometimes my sleeve gets a bit attached to them. So see what kind of interesting textures you can create. So I'm just going to finish this video here, and then I'll see you in the next one.